You have seen the fall of Rome explained 100 times. Barbarians at the gates, a decadent empire gone soft, a last emperor deposed in 476, the lights going out on the ancient world. If that version is enough for you, you are free to go watch any of the 100 other tellings of it. They all say more or less the same thing. But there is one detail almost none of them mention, and it does not sit quietly beside the story you already know. It replaces it. In a field in eastern Britain, a wealthy man buried 569 gold coins in the year 408 and never came back for them. And we can date the moment he gave up on Rome almost to the season. He was not the first. The gold went into the ground across the whole empire in a wave you can plot on a graph, decades before any barbarian took the city, because the people with the most to lose and the best information had already read the ending and started quietly getting their wealth out. So get comfortable and subscribe or join if you have not, because tonight we follow that buried gold all the way down. Through the woman who sold estates in 8 provinces and sailed out of Italy just ahead of the sack. Through the day the empire admitted in writing it could no longer pay to defend itself. And across the world to a people whose rulers could not run, and so were buried where they stood. The wider trail through space, physics, history, and the way civilizations actually come apart lives over on the Patreon. Stay to the end, because the unsettling part is not that Rome fell. It is that the warning was measurable, and measurable means measurable now. Let's go back to where this began. In the autumn of the year 408, somewhere in the flat farmland of eastern Britain, a wealthy man got down on his knees in the dirt and buried almost everything he owned. He had packed it carefully. He had lined a wooden chest with smaller boxes made of yew and cherry wood, the kind of craftsmanship you only commission when you intend to come back. Inside went 569 coins of pure gold, 14,272 coins of silver, necklaces, bracelets, spoons with the names of his family scratched into the handles, about 3.5 kilograms of gold, and nearly 24 kilograms of silver, the entire liquid fortune of a single rich household, sealed in oak and lowered into a hole in the ground. He never came back for it. And here is the part I want you to sit with before we go any further, because everything in the next 2 hours grows out of this one fact. The most unsettling thing about that man is not that he buried his fortune in a field. It is that he was right to. We know almost exactly when he did it. The newest coins in that chest were minted under an emperor named Constantine III, and they date to the year 407 or 408. That is the flaw. The chest cannot have gone into the ground before then. And 407 to 408 is the precise window, give or take a season, when Roman administration let go of Britain forever. The legions were pulled, the tax collectors stopped coming. The imperial machine that had governed that island for almost 4 centuries simply withdrew and never returned. This man buried his gold at the exact moment the system that protected it was walking out the door, and he buried it because he knew. He had read the situation correctly. He understood, in 408, something that the official version of history would not get around to admitting for the better part of 1,000 years. He understood that it was over. That chest is real. It sat in the soil of Suffolk for 1,584 years, until a man with a metal detector, looking for a friend's lost hammer, found it in 1992. It is in the British Museum right now. You can go and look at it. We call it the Hoxne hoard, after the village it was found near, and it is the richest single cache of late Roman gold and silver ever recovered from anywhere in the entire empire. It is, in the most literal sense, a message. A man in the year 408 wrote a letter to the future in the only language that does not rot, and the letter says one thing: I saw it coming, I got my wealth out. And I was not the only one, because this is what nobody told you about how civilizations end. They do not end the way the textbooks draw them, with a date and a sack and a barbarian king sitting on a stolen throne. That is the funeral. That is the part everyone can see, which is exactly why everyone remembers it and nothing else. The actual ending happens earlier, quietly, in private, in the decisions of the people who have the most to lose and the best information about how much danger it is in. It happens when the people at the top stop believing in the thing they are running and start, very calmly, very rationally, getting their own money out. They do not announce it. They do not fix anything. They hedge. And the genuinely disturbing discovery, the one I cannot stop thinking about, is that this is not invisible. It leaves a mark. It leaves a measurable, datable, physical signature in the ground and in the law books and in the tax records. And that signature appears decades before the collapse becomes obvious to everyone else. You can date the moment the smart money stopped believing. For Rome, that date is not 476, the year a Germanic general finally deposed the last child emperor and the history books drew their tidy line. The smart money had stopped believing roughly 100 years before that. The man in the Suffolk field is not an early sign of the end. By 408, he is a late sign. He is one of the last ones out the door, and he is still 70 years ahead of the official date of death. I spent an unreasonable amount of time on this, longer than I am comfortable admitting, reading hoard reports and Roman tax law and the letters of dead aristocrats, and the thing that kept me up was not how it ended. We all know how it ended. It was how legible the ending was in advance to the people who chose not to say it out loud. The information was there. The gold went into the ground in datable layers, like rings in a tree. The laws got written and rewritten in a rising panic you can read across a century. The richest families on earth quietly liquidated estates the size of small countries and moved their wealth somewhere safer, and they did it in a sequence so clear that you can almost watch it happen frame by frame. And almost nobody connected the dots. Not at the time, and, in a way I will get to that, genuinely angered me, not for a very long time afterward either, because we found a lot of those gold chests, and we filed them under the wrong year and missed what they were telling us. The warning did not get lost. We catalogued it. We put it in a drawer. So the question I want to hold open for the next 2 hours is not why Rome fell. There are, by one historian's count, 210 separate published theories for why Rome fell. And we will not settle that argument today, because nobody ever has. The question is sharper and worse than that. The question is this: how early can you actually see the end of a civilization coming? And if it turns out you can see it very early indeed, decades early, written in gold and law and stone, then why does seeing it never seem to stop it? Why does the warning sign never get acted on? I think the answer is the most unsettling thing I have ever come across in history, and I think it is the reason this story has been told to you backwards your whole life. But to get there, I cannot start with the answer. I have to start with the gold, because the gold is the part you can hold in your hand, and the gold does not lie. Let me show you the pattern in the ground. One chest in a field is an anecdote. A rich man got scared, buried his money, and died or fled before he could dig it up. That happens in every century. It does not, by itself, tell you anything about the death of an empire. To know whether the Hoxne hoard is a warning or just a personal tragedy, you have to zoom out and ask a colder question. How often were people doing this, and when? This turns out to be a thing you can measure with real precision. And the reason is the single most useful accident in the study of the ancient economy. A buried Roman hoard is a clock. Coins carry the face and the name of the emperor who minted them, and we know, often to the year, when each type was struck. The newest coin in any hoard tells you the earliest possible moment it could have gone into the ground, because you cannot bury a coin that has not been made yet. Archaeologists call this the terminus post quem, the limit after which. A chest whose newest coin is from 408 was buried in 408 or later, full stop. It is the closest thing the ancient world left us to a timestamp. Now do that for not one hoard, but for hundreds of them, thousands of them, scattered across the whole Western Empire, and a shape appears. You can plot, decade by decade, how often Romans were taking their portable wealth and putting it in the earth, and then never coming back to retrieve it. That last part matters more than it sounds. A buried hoard that was dug up again and spent leaves no trace. The only hoards we find are the ones nobody ever recovered. Every chest in every museum represents a person who buried their wealth for safekeeping, and then, for some reason, was never again in a position to get it. They died. They fled and did not return. The world they buried it in stopped existing before they could come back. So the map of unrecovered hoards is not a map of where Romans kept their savings. It is a map of where Roman lives came apart. It is a map of fear that came true. And the wave has a direction, which is the detail that turns it from a curiosity into something closer to a weather system you can track. The burials do not appear everywhere at once. They cluster first and heaviest in the most exposed places, the frontier provinces, the coasts within reach of raiders, the regions closest to where the threat was coming from. And then the pattern migrates inward as the danger does. The hedge moves the way a shadow moves across a field at the end of the day. Edges first, center last. Britain, sitting at the far northwestern lip of the empire, gets its great wave of unrecovered burials right at the moment the imperial connection is severed. Because Britain is where the protection failed first. The fear is not random, it is informed. It tracks the actual collapse of imperial security in real time, province by province, which is precisely what you would expect if the people doing the burying were reading the situation correctly rather than panicking blindly. And Hoxne is not alone, which is the thing that makes it evidence rather than anecdote. The same soil of late Roman Britain has given up hoard after hoard from the same desperate window. The Mildenhall treasure, a stunning set of Roman silver from the same corner of East Anglia, the great silver dish at its center, weighing more than 8 kilograms, almost certainly went into the ground in the same 4th century crisis. The Thetford hoard, gold jewelry and silver spoons, buried late in the same century. Across the western provinces, the story repeats in different accents, families taking the most portable, most valuable, most concentrated forms of their wealth and entrusting them to the one bank that never failed in the ancient world, a hole in the ground, and then never living to make the withdrawal. Each one is a small sealed tragedy. Together they are a graph, and the graph has a shape, and the shape is a society's confidence collapsing along a measurable curve. I have to be fair to the obvious objection here, because a careful person should raise it, and this audience is nothing if not careful. Buried treasure is a biased witness. We only ever find the hoards nobody came back for, which means the record is skewed toward catastrophe by its very nature. And on top of that, there is a genuine archaeological argument that parts of Britain, East Anglia especially, had a long ritual tradition of depositing metal in the ground for reasons that had nothing to do with panic, an inheritance from the pre-Roman past. Not every buried hoard is a frightened aristocrat. Some are offerings. Some are savings that the owner simply died sitting on, in any century, in any condition of peace or war. A single chest, taken alone, tells you about one person and nothing more. All of that is true, And I am not going to pretend it away to make the story cleaner. But the objection dies the moment you stop looking at any single horde and look at the timing of the whole population of them. Because ritual deposition does not spike in synchrony with barbarian invasions, and ordinary death does not cluster around the abandonment of a province. The wave does. The burials pile up exactly when and exactly where the protection failed, and that correlation is not something you can explain with old religious habits or bad luck. The ground was keeping a record, and the record is of fear, and the fear was right. And the shape of that map is brutally clear. In the well-studied data, and Britain is the best-studied corner of the entire Roman world for this, the burial of precious metal hoards spikes in exactly the periods of maximum danger. There is a huge peak in the middle and late 3rd century, during the stretch historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, when the empire nearly tore itself apart in civil war and invasion, and very nearly ended right there, 150 years early. The fear receded, things stabilized, more or less. And then, in the late 4th century and the opening years of the 5th, the burials spike again, and this time they do not come back down, because this time the world that people were hiding their wealth from did not stabilize. It ended. That first peak, the 3rd century one, deserves a moment of its own, because it is the dress rehearsal, and the way it was survived is part of why the second time was fatal. In the 50 years between roughly 235 and 284, the Roman Empire very nearly died. Emperors came and went so fast that the period gives us more than 20 of them in half a century, most murdered, the army making and unmaking rulers like a mob. The frontiers caved in. The currency, the everyday silver coinage, was debased into near worthlessness in exactly this window, which is when the great inflation that I mentioned really took hold. Whole provinces broke away and ran themselves for years. It was, by any measure, a collapse, and the hoards in the ground proved that the people living through it knew it, and buried their wealth in terror, just as their descendants would a century and a half later. But that time, the empire clawed its way back. A run of hard soldier emperors, above all Diocletian, and then Constantine, pulled it out of the fire and rebuilt it. And here is the part that matters for our story, because the rebuild planted the seeds of the final hedge. The way they saved the empire was by locking everything down. To stabilize the tax base after the chaos, they bound people to their stations by law, the farmer to his land, the soldier's son to the army, and the curial to his council, hereditarily, permanently, to stabilize the money. Constantine created the gold solidus and kept it pure, while letting the everyday coinage stay garbage, which is the exact origin of the two-tier currency. The recovery was real, but it was bought by hardening the empire into something more rigid, more coercive, more stratified, a system that held its people in place by force and held its wealth at the top in gold. They saved Rome by building the machine that would, when the pressure came again, give the elite a perfect escape and give everyone else a perfect cage. The 3rd century taught the survivors a lesson, and the lesson the powerful took from it was not how to make the system resilient for everyone. The lesson was that gold endures and everything else can be made disposable, including, eventually, the empire itself. That second spike is the one I want you to keep your eye on, because that is the smart money leaving. That is the sound, if fear made a sound, of the people with the most to protect, deciding that the institution that had protected it for 400 years could no longer be trusted to do so. And the dates cluster. They cluster around the great shocks, the crossing of the frozen Rhine by tens of thousands of barbarians on the last night of the year 406, the loss of Britain in 407 and 8, the Gothic armies moving through Italy, The Hoxne man is not an outlier. He is one data point in a wave, and the wave is the leading indicator. The wave shows up first. This is the part that should start to bother you, because we tend to think of the fall of Rome as something that was done to the Romans. Barbarians came, Rome fell, the lights went out. But the hordes are not a record of barbarians. The hordes are a record of Romans, specifically wealthy Romans, the only people who had gold to bury, looking at their own civilization and concluding, privately, individually, decades before the end, that the smart move was to pull their wealth out of circulation and into a hole in the ground. The hordes are the elite voting with their assets, and the vote is unanimous, and it is no. I want to introduce you to the man who more than anyone forced our field to understand what these dates actually mean, because his story is also a small institutional scandal, and it is the first of several in this story, where the warning was sitting in plain sight and the experts looked straight past it. His name is Peter Guest. He is a numismatist, a specialist in ancient coins, and he is the scholar who published the definitive study of the coins in the Hoxne hoard. And in the course of that work, he noticed something that, once you see it, you cannot unsee, and that called a whole pile of conventional dating into question. For a long time, the assumption baked into British archaeology was that the latest Roman hoards in Britain were buried around 402, because that is roughly when the official supply of fresh Roman coinage to the islands stopped. No new coins after that, so the thinking went, no burials after that. Guest looked at the actual contents and at the wear patterns, and at what the coins were doing in the years after the supply stopped, and argued that this was backwards. The coins did not stop circulating when the empire stopped shipping them. They kept circulating, and the great burials came later, after 408, after 409, in the chaos of the separation of Britain from Rome itself. We had been dating the panic to before the rupture. The panic actually belonged to the rupture and after it. Think about what that quiet correction does to the picture. It means a whole category of evidence for the exact moment the elite gave up on Roman Britain had been systematically misdated, shoved a few years too early into a period that made it look like routine economic disruption rather than what it was, which was flight. The clock was telling the right time. We had been reading it wrong on purpose, not out of malice, but out of the comfortable assumption that the official story, coins stop, end of Roman Britain, must be the true one. The hordes were screaming a more specific and more disturbing message about elite behavior at the moment of collapse, and it took a coin specialist counting wear on bronze to make the field hear it. That pattern, where the evidence of elite flight is right there and the experts file it under something blander, is going to come back. Hold on to it. But the hordes raise a harder question than they answer, and this is where we have to go deeper. Burying gold proves fear. It does not, by itself, prove knowledge. A frightened person and an informed person both bury their money. To make the case that this was the elite reading the situation correctly and hedging, rather than just ordinary people panicking, you have to follow the gold up the social ladder, all the way to the top, and ask who actually had this kind of wealth, how much of it there was, and what form they were keeping it in. Because the form matters enormously. You cannot bury a wheat field. You cannot put a villa in a chest and carry it to Africa. The only way to hedge against the collapse of a territorial empire is to convert the thing you cannot move, land, into the thing you can, gold. And it turns out the late Roman super-rich did exactly that, on a scale that is genuinely hard to hold in your head. So let me tell you how rich these people were, because until you feel the size of the fortunes, you cannot feel the size of the bet they were quietly walking away from. Our best witness is a Greek historian named Olympiodorus of Thebes, who actually visited Rome in the 420s, walked its streets, talked to its people, and wrote down what he saw. His history is lost. We only have it because a Byzantine churchman named Photius, 4 centuries later, sat down and summarized the books in his library, and Olympiodorus was one of them. So everything we have is second-hand, a summary of a summary, and you should hold the exact figures loosely for that reason. But the figures are astonishing, and they line up with everything else we know, and historians from Edward Gibbon onward have taken them seriously. Olympiodorus reported that the richest senatorial households of Rome were pulling in about 4,000 pounds of gold every single year from their estates. Not their total wealth, their annual income. On top of that, he says, they took in income in kind, grain and wine and oil from their lands, that if you sold it would come to about a third again on top of the gold. And the merely middling senators, the ones he describes as comfortable but not spectacular, were drawing 1,000 to 1,500 pounds of gold a year. 4,000 pounds of gold. Let me translate that out of an abstraction and into something with weight. The standard gold coin of the late empire was the solidus, introduced by Constantine in the early 4th century at about 99% purity, and it held that purity while every other coin in the empire was being debased into worthless scrap. And that clause, the one about every other coin being debased into worthless scrap, is not a throwaway. It is one of the most important and least discussed facts in this entire story, because it means the Roman world ran in its final centuries on 2 completely separate currencies, and which one you held depended entirely on who you were. There was the gold solidus, the hard money, the coin that held its purity decade after decade, the coin the rich were paid in and saved in, and could carry anywhere in the world and trust to be worth the same on arrival. And then there was everything else, the silver and the bronze, the small change of ordinary life, the money the poor and the middling actually used to buy bread and pay rent. And over the course of the 3rd and 4th centuries, that everyday money was systematically destroyed by debasement. Emperors desperate for revenue had stretched the silver coinage thinner and thinner, mixing in more base metal, minting more coins out of less actual precious metal, until a coin that had once been mostly silver was a sliver of silver wash over a copper core, and then barely that. The everyday money inflated away. Prices in that soft currency ran wild. A document from Egypt records the price of a measure of wheat rising by something on the order of tens of thousands of times across roughly a century. The money in the ordinary person's hand was melting in real time, but the gold did not melt. That is the whole point. The solidus stayed pure, on purpose, because it was the money of the state's accounts and the money of the wealthy, and the wealthy and the state had every interest in keeping it sound. So the empire developed, without anyone ever quite deciding it, a 2-tier monetary system that functioned as a perfect machine for transferring wealth upward and leaving everyone else exposed. The rich held the currency that held its value. The poor held the currency that lost it. And when the danger came, the rich could hedge precisely because their wealth was already in the one form that travels, the form that buries well, the form that survives the death of the state that minted it, because gold does not care whose face is stamped on it. The poor had no hedge available at all. You cannot bury your way to safety with a sack of debased copper that is losing value faster than you can dig the hole. The instrument of escape, hard portable money, was a thing only the people at the top possessed. Understand what that does to the moral shape of the story. When we say the Roman elite hedged and the Roman poor did not, we are not describing a difference in foresight or wisdom or character. The poor may have seen the danger just as clearly. Salvian tells us they did, that they fled to the barbarians with their eyes open. The difference was that the elite held the kind of wealth you can run with, and the poor held the kind that evaporates if you so much as look at it. The hedge was not available to everyone who could see the cliff coming. It was available only to the people whose wealth was already detachable, already liquid, already gold, and the two-tier currency had spent a century making sure there was a smaller and smaller circle of people. The escape hatch was real, and it was bolted shut from the outside for almost everyone. There were 72 solidi struck from each Roman pound of gold. So 4,000 pounds of gold a year is 288,000 gold solidi per year, flowing into a single household. And gold is heavy, which is worth pausing on, because it turns the abstraction into something physical you can almost feel in your arms. 4,000 Roman pounds of gold is well over a metric ton in today's measure. More than 1,000 kilograms of pure gold flowing into one family every year, year after year. That is not a chest you bury in a field. That is a wagon train. The richest households of Rome were taking in, annually, a quantity of gold you would need carts and teams of animals to move, drawn from the rents of land worked by tens of thousands of other people, while the small coins those other people actually held in their hands were turning to worthless metal in the same economy. The scale of it is the thing that should sit wrong with you, because a society does not collapse for lack of wealth when wealth like that is moving through it. It collapses when the wealth stops being shared with the thing that protects it. Here is one way to feel that number. The pay and upkeep of a late Roman soldier, once you account for everything, is genuinely hard to reconstruct. Because by this period, a lot of military pay had been converted into rations and equipment rather than cash. And I want to be honest with you about that uncertainty rather than hand you a fake precision. But taking a defensible figure for the full annual cost of maintaining one soldier, a single one of those top senatorial fortunes could have paid for and supplied something on the order of 8,000 soldiers for a year. One family. 8,000 men under arms, out of the rents from their land. And now the number that I think is the hinge of this entire story. In the year 408, the Gothic king Alaric brought his army to the walls of Rome and besieged the city, and to make him go away, to buy off the sack of the capital of the world, the Roman Senate agreed to pay him a ransom. The ransom was 4,000 pounds of gold. Read those two figures against each other and feel the floor tilt. The price of saving the city of Rome from a barbarian army, the ransom for the eternal capital itself, was exactly equal to the annual income of one of its richest senators. One man's yearly rents could have paid the ransom for the whole city. The defense of the empire had become, against the scale of private fortunes, a rounding error. The wealth was there. The wealth was sitting in senatorial households in quantities that could have funded armies. It simply was not being spent on the army. It was being spent on palaces and on banquets, and, increasingly, it was being converted into gold and moved somewhere the empire could not reach. And I do mean banquets. Ammianus Marcellinus, our witness from the 380s, describes the lifestyle these fortunes paid for with a contempt that comes right off the page 16 centuries later. He writes of senators who measured their worth by the height of their carriages and the fineness of their silk, who paraded through Rome with crowds of attendants, who would throw the kind of feast where the menu and the seating were planned like a military campaign, while complaining bitterly about the cost of everything. He describes one senator boasting about his estates, ticking off provinces. The historian Olympiodorus, in that same fragment about senatorial income, mentions almost in passing that some of these households spent fortunes on a single set of games when they entered public office, sums that run into the hundreds of thousands of solidi, a young senator lighting more gold on fire in a few days of public spectacle than most of his fellow citizens would see in 1,000 lifetimes. The wealth was not being hoarded out of caution alone. A great deal of it was being burned on display. on the performance of being rich, even as the same families converted the rest into gold and quietly shipped it out of reach. Let me put a name and a face on that, because the abstraction of fortunes burned on display becomes something else entirely when you watch a single father do it. Quintus Aurelius Symmachus was one of the most distinguished senators of his age, an orator, a former prefect of the city of Rome, the kind of man whose letters we still read today. And in the year 401, he staged the public games to celebrate his son being raised to the office of praetor, a boy of about 17 taking up a junior magistracy that by then carried almost no real power and existed mostly as an occasion for spectacle. The cost that comes down to us is 2,000 pounds of gold. For 1 week, 2,000 pounds of gold is 144,000 solidi, which means a single week of one boy's games cost something on the order of half of what even the richest households took in across an entire year, and many times over what a comfortable senator made. Olympiodorus, our same witness to senatorial income, recorded sums precisely like this. Young senators pouring 2,000 and even 4,000 pounds of gold into the games that launched their careers. Symmachus began planning his son's spectacle 2 years in advance. He wrote letters all across the Mediterranean, procuring exotic animals and performers, and he brought in a group of Saxon prisoners of war to die in the arena, 29 of whom strangled one another in their cells the night before rather than perform. That is what a slice of one of these fortunes looked like when it was spent in public rather than buried in private. A fortune in gold poured out over a few days of blood and display, 29 men choosing to kill each other over the role they had been purchased to play, all to mark the career step of a teenager. And here is the detail that closes the circle. Symmachus died in the year 402, the year after the games, which was the very year the Gothic king Alaric first brought his army into Italy. He spent 2,000 pounds of gold, celebrating his family's permanence in the Roman order at almost the exact moment that order began visibly to come apart, and he did not live to see what came next. He did not hedge, he spent. He was, in that sense, the precise opposite of the man at Hoxne, and the unbearable thing is that both of them were looking at the same empire, and only one of them read it correctly. Let me give you one more way to feel the size of these fortunes, because the soldier comparison is abstract, and I want it in your gut. 4,000 pounds of gold a year, the income of a single top household, is 288,000 solidi. The grain dole that fed the population of the city of Rome, the bread that kept hundreds of thousands of ordinary Romans alive, was one of the great fixed expenses of the ancient state. A single one of these senatorial incomes, redirected, could have bought staggering quantities of that grain, could have fed a substantial fraction of a city on its own. We are talking about private individuals whose annual rents rivaled the food budget of a metropolis. And there were not one or two of these families. There were dozens of the very richest, and behind them a larger class of the merely enormously wealthy. The concentrated private fortune of the late Roman aristocracy was, in aggregate, more than enough to have funded the defense of the empire several times over. The money to save Rome existed the entire time. It was simply in private hands that had decided, one by one, that they would rather keep it than spend it on a sinking ship, and who had the means, in pure portable gold, to walk away with it when the ship went down. I need to stop here for a moment and correct something, because this is exactly the kind of place where the popular story has it backwards, and getting it right is the whole game. The story you have probably absorbed is that Rome fell because it was poor, overstretched, bankrupt, drained, unable to pay its bills, collapsing under its own economic exhaustion. And the late Roman state was indeed desperate for money. That part is true. But the empire was not poor. The empire was breathtakingly obscenely rich. The wealth had simply concentrated into very few hands, and those hands had stopped letting it flow back into the thing that kept them rich. Rome did not die of poverty. Rome died of inequality so extreme that the people who held the wealth no longer had any incentive to save the system that produced it, because they had already figured out how to survive its death personally. That is a completely different cause of death, and it is a far more uncomfortable one, because poverty is bad luck, and what actually happened was a choice. Which brings me to the single human being who, for me, makes this entire abstract pattern snap into focus. Because she did the thing the hordes only hint at. She did it at the very top of Roman society, and she did it so completely and so well documented that we can trace her wealth moving across the empire, almost like watching a man bury a chest in a field, except in slow motion and on a continental scale. Her name was Melania. Historians call her Melania the Younger, to distinguish her from her grandmother, who we will get to, and who is part of why this story is even stranger than it looks. Melania the Younger was born around the year 385 into the Valeri, one of the oldest and richest families in the entire Roman world. We are talking about wealth that beggars the senatorial figures I just gave you, according to the account of her life, and I will flag the sources as we go, because some of these numbers come from a devotional biography written by an admirer and should be held with appropriate care. Her property was spread across at least 8 Roman provinces: Italy, Sicily, Spain, Britain, Africa, Numidia, Mauritania, Campania. One of her estates in Sicily alone is described as having 60 large houses on it, each worked by 400 agricultural slaves. 60 houses. On one estate, she owned land in 8 provinces of a Mediterranean empire, which is to say she owned pieces of nearly the entire Western world. And starting around the year 404, Melania the Younger, with her husband Pinyanus, began to sell all of it. Now I have to be very careful and very honest here, because the temptation is to make Melania into a cynical doomsday prepper who saw the end coming and cashed out, and that is not what she was, and pretending otherwise would be a lie that this audience would catch. Melania's stated reason for liquidating one of the largest private fortunes in the world was religious. She was an intense Christian ascetic, part of a movement of wealthy Romans who believed that salvation required giving away worldly possessions, and she gave the proceeds of her sales to the church and to the poor. Her motive, as far as we can tell, was sincere renunciation, not financial self-preservation. I am not going to tell you she was secretly a cynic. The record does not support it. And I want to slow down and tell you who she actually was, because the human being underneath the fortune is the thing that makes this land, and her life was shaped by loss in a way that mirrors the economics with an almost unbearable precision. Most of what we know comes from a biography written after her death by a devoted follower named Gerontius, which means it is hagiography, a saint's life, and you should keep one hand on your wallet when reading the numbers in it. But the shape of her early life is consistent across the sources, and the shape is grief. She was born into the absolute summit of Roman society, the only surviving child of a fabulously wealthy senatorial father, and she wanted, from very young, to give it all up and live as a celibate ascetic. She was not allowed. Her family married her off around the age of 13 or 14 to a cousin named Valerius Pinyanus, because the preservation of the bloodline and the consolidation of the family fortune required heirs, and a girl that rich did not get to opt out of producing them. So she did the thing she had been married to do. She bore a daughter who was dedicated to a life of virginity. And then she became pregnant a second time, and the second birth went catastrophically wrong. According to the account, she delivered prematurely during a religious festival after pushing herself too hard, and the child, a son, died almost immediately. She herself nearly died in the process. And in the aftermath of that, lying in danger, having lost the infant, She extracted from her husband an agreement that they would from then on live in celibacy and turn together to renunciation. Her surviving daughter, by most readings, did not long outlive these years either. The children did not make it. The heirs the whole marriage had been arranged to produce, the future the fortune was meant to flow into, were gone. Think about what that means against everything we have been saying. Melania spent her life converting one form of wealth, land, into another form, portable gold and silver, that she gave away, and she did it with a skill that outpaced the entire imperial economy. But there was one form of wealth she could not convert, could not preserve, could not protect with any amount of money or foresight, and that was her own bloodline, the continuation of her family into the next generation. The children died regardless. The one asset that was truly non-transferable, truly rooted, truly unable to be made liquid and carried to safety, was the one she lost. And it happened years before she lost the palace on the Kilian Hill for the very same structural reason, that the thing too rooted to move is the thing the world takes from you. Her biography rhymes with her balance sheet. The portable she saved, the rooted she buried, first her son, then her palace, then the whole world she came from. It also explains the timing of the great divestment, because she was not free to begin it while her father lived. He opposed the renunciation fiercely, as any Roman patriarch would oppose his only heir giving away the patrimony of generations. And only after his death, around the year 404 or 405, were Melania and Pinyanus finally able to start dismantling the estate in earnest. And even then, the Roman establishment fought them. The sale of such vast holdings threatened to flood markets and disrupt the careful web of senatorial property, and there is an account that the Senate itself, or interested parties within it, moved to obstruct the sales, that officials tried to block the liquidation, that the family had to go over their heads. Which is exactly why they ended up at the feet of the imperial court, getting the Emperor Honorius himself to order his bureaucrats to assist. The richest woman in Rome had to obtain an imperial decree to be permitted to sell her own property, because everyone around her understood, on some level, that what she was doing was pulling an enormous quantity of value out of the Roman land system and converting it into something the system could not hold on to. And a part of that system tried to stop her, and failed. But here is what makes her story so much more disturbing than if she had been a cynic. The behavior is identical. Strip away the motive and look only at the actions, the way an archaeologist looks only at the gold without knowing the heart of the man who buried it. And what you see is the single most sophisticated wealth conversion maneuver of the entire late empire. An ultra-informed insider at the very top of society, with assets spread across the whole system, systematically converting illiquid, immovable land into portable, movable, escapable wealth, and physically relocating herself and that wealth out of the most exposed regions and into the safest ones, in a sequence whose timing, in hindsight, is almost unbearable. Because watch where she goes and when. Around 404, she begins selling and frees, by one account, around 8,000 slaves out of a reported 24,000 on her estates. She liquidates her holdings in province after province, and she sells her estates in Britain, the most exposed, most peripheral, most indefensible province in the entire empire, only a year or two before the Roman legions are withdrawn from Britain forever. Sit with the timing of that. She got out of Britain at almost the last possible moment that getting out of Britain was still worth anything, right before the man at Hoxne was burying his gold in a field, because the system that gave that gold its value was walking away. Melania sold the province. The Hoxne man buried what he could not sell. Same event, two ends of the same elite, both reading the same writing on the same wall. Then she moves. from Rome to Sicily, and she is in Sicily by around 408, the year of Alaric's first siege. From Sicily to North Africa, around 410, which happens to be the year Alaric finally takes and sacks the city of Rome itself. She is out of Italy before the catastrophe lands on Italy. And from Africa, eventually, to Jerusalem, where she lived out her life. Rome to Sicily to Africa to Jerusalem, each move one step further from the center of the collapse, each move made just ahead of the wave. If you drew her journey on a map next to the burial dates of the hordes and the dates of the great invasions, the lines would braid together. She is moving in perfect, terrible synchrony with the thing she said she was renouncing for spiritual reasons. And she had help from the highest possible level, which tells you the imperial government itself understood and facilitated this kind of elite divestment, rather than trying to stop it. To liquidate property on this scale, Melania needed administrative cooperation across the whole empire, and she got it. She approached the imperial court, probably in the year 408, and according to the record, the Emperor Honorius not only allowed her and her husband to dispose of their property as they saw fit, he ordered bureaucrats throughout the empire to act as her agents in carrying out the sales. The emperor put the machinery of the state at the service of one of the richest families in the world as they converted the empire's land into portable gold and carried it away. The system was actively helping its own elite cash out of it. Now here is the detail that I think is the most perfect, most novelistic, most unbearable irony in the whole story, and I promise I am not embellishing it. There was one asset Melania could not sell. Her great palace on the Kilian Hill in Rome, the family seat, was so enormous and so valuable that no private buyer in the entire city could afford to purchase it. The richest people in Rome could not muster the money to buy a single Roman palace. So it sat, unsold, the one piece of her fortune too large to convert into something portable, too large to escape with, stranded in the center of the doomed city. And in the year 410, when Alaric's army poured into Rome, his men sacked and burned that palace. After the fire, the gutted ruin was, by the account, given away for almost nothing, because now it was worth almost nothing. The one asset she could not turn into gold was the one the collapse destroyed. Everything she had managed to liquidate, she kept. The single thing too big to liquidate, she lost. If you wanted a parable for the entire mechanics of elite hedging, the rule that says get liquid or get caught, you could not write a cleaner one than the true story of the palace that was too valuable to sell and so was burned for free. And lest you think Melania the Younger was a lone savant who happened to read the runes correctly, let me bring in her grandmother, because the grandmother is the proof that this was not luck. It was knowledge being passed down openly among the people who had it. Melania the Elder was, if anything, more formidable than her granddaughter, a Roman noblewoman who had pulled her own version of the same maneuver a generation earlier, divesting and relocating to the eastern Mediterranean and Jerusalem long before. And there is a line attributed to her, recorded by the writer Palladius, that she said to the Roman senators, to the very people whose gold was about to start going into the ground. She warned them, before the sack of 410, to beware lest the days of the Antichrist overtake them and they not be allowed to enjoy their wealth and their ancestral property. You can read that as religious prophecy, and to her it surely was. But translate it out of the language of the apocalypse and into the language of risk, and listen to what she is actually telling the Roman 1% at a dinner party around the year 400. She is telling them their wealth is not safe. She is telling them the ancestral estates, the land, the immovable foundation of their entire status, is about to become a liability they will not be permitted to enjoy. She is telling them to get out while they still can. The insiders were not just hedging. They were saying it to each other, out loud, at the table. The warning was being spoken in the highest rooms in the world. It simply was not being spoken in any room where ordinary people could hear it, and it was certainly not being acted on by anyone responsible for keeping the system alive. And that gap between the rooms where the warning was spoken and the rooms where it was not is itself part of the machinery, and it is worth naming directly. The knowledge that the system was failing was not evenly distributed, because knowledge of that kind never is. It traveled through the networks of the powerful, the dinner parties, the family correspondence, the imperial court, the circles where a Melania could get an emperor to assign her his own bureaucrats, and a Symmachus could spend 2 years arranging a week of games. The people in those rooms knew what their own gold was doing. They knew which provinces they were quietly selling out of, and why. They could see the shape of the danger because they were the ones drawing it. The farmer in Gaul and the shopkeeper in a British town had access to none of that. They had rumors and the official line and the visible everyday facts that the soldiers still marched and the coins still carried the emperor's face and the games still happened on schedule. From the bottom, right up until nearly the end, the surface of the empire looked much as it always had. The collapse was legible in advance only to the people positioned to read it, and those were precisely the people whose response to reading it was to get themselves out rather than to raise an alarm, because raising an alarm would have gained them nothing and cost them plenty. It might have started the panic early. It might have lowered the price of everything they were quietly trying to sell. The structure of the information guaranteed that the people who could see the cliff most clearly were the people with the least reason to tell anyone else it was there. This is the abdication that I find genuinely hard to forgive across 16 centuries, and we are only halfway down. The people who understood the danger best were the people best positioned to do something about it, and what they did about it was save themselves. But individuals leaving is not the same as an empire dying. Melania got her wealth out. The Hoxne man got his gold into the ground. So what? Rich people have always fled sinking ships. For the elite Hedge to actually be a cause of collapse, and not just a symptom, you would have to show that they were not only moving their personal wealth, but dismantling the machinery of the state as they went, pulling out the very resources that kept the system standing. And that, it turns out, is exactly what the next layer of evidence shows. To see it, we have to stop looking at the gold and start looking at the walls, because the second physical signature of the elite Hedge is not buried in the ground. It is still standing, in the form of stone, all across what used to be the Western Empire, and once you know how to read it, it is as loud as the hordes. The Roman villa, at the height of the empire, was an architecture of confidence. Open colonnades, wide unfortified courtyards, gardens that ran into the countryside with nothing between them and the world but ornamental hedges. You do not build a house like that unless you believe, all the way down in your bones, that the world outside your walls is safe, that the Roman peace will hold, that the legions are somewhere over the horizon making sure nobody comes for you. The classic Roman country estate is a building that assumes the empire will protect it. It is trust, rendered in marble. And then, across the 4th and into the 5th century, those buildings start to grow walls. In Gaul, which is roughly modern France and the richest, most studied part of the Western provinces, the archaeology of the late period is an archaeology of fortification. The open villa contracts. Defensive walls go up around estates that never needed them before. Towers appear. The survey work on the villas of northwestern Gaul records the transition in cold, specific terms. From the early 4th century onward, more and more villas appear to be standing empty. Coins and datable pottery The things that tell you a place is economically alive become rare on these sites, which means the money and the trade had stopped flowing through them. On the estates that were still occupied, archaeologists find more cheap temporary wooden construction patched onto the old stone, the sign of people hunkering down rather than investing. And on some of them they find new fortifications, walls thrown up around buildings that had stood open for 300 years. It is not only the private estates, the cities do it too. Across Gaul, more than 100 fortifications appear across the countryside in the late Roman centuries, and the cities themselves pull in behind massive new walls. At the town we now call Le Mans, the late Roman enclosure was built with curtain walls something like 4.5 meters thick and as much as 10 meters high, studded with towers. At Chalon-sur-Saône, a wall about 3.5 meters thick with round towers. These are not decorative. These are the walls of a society that has stopped believing the frontier will hold and has decided that safety is now a local, private, do-it-yourself problem. The empire used to be the wall. Now every town and every estate had to be its own wall. The protection had stopped coming from the center, so it retreated behind stone at the edges. And the people who built those walls were the same class burying the gold, and we can hear one of them talk, because one of the most articulate aristocrats of the dying Western world left us a pile of letters, and his whole life is the hedge made flesh. His name was Sidonius Apollinaris, born around the year 430 into the absolute top of Gallo-Roman society. His grandfather and his father had both held the office of Praetorian Prefect of Gaul, about the highest administrative post the region had. Sidonius was a senator, a man of letters, briefly even the prefect of the city of Rome itself. He was, in every way, an insider's insider, the kind of man who in an earlier century would have spent his life in the service of the empire and assumed the empire would last forever. And what did he do with his life as the Western Empire came apart around him? He retreated to his country villa, an estate he loved and described in loving detail in his letters, the fortified, self-sufficient rural seat where a great family could ride out the storm. He became a bishop, taking on the one institution, the church, that looked like it might outlast the state. And in the years 473 to 475, when the Visigothic king Euric was swallowing southern Gaul, Sidonius personally led the defense of his city, Clermont, against the siege. Not the imperial army. The bishop, the local aristocrat, defending his own town with his own resources, because there was no longer an empire that would do it for him. There is a scholar, Sigrid Miracek, who argues that Sidonius used his letters and his literature deliberately as a way to shore up the position of the Roman aristocracy in Gaul, to preserve their prestige and identity as compensation for the military and political collapse of the actual Roman state. Read that again and feel how strange it is. The empire, as a functioning protective institution, was finished, and so its aristocracy turned to curating the memory and the style of being Roman, the literature, the manners, the villa life, as a kind of cultural bunker to survive in. The estate had become the unit of survival. The empire had become a thing you performed rather than a thing that protected you. Sidonius is what the hedge looks like from the inside, by a man eloquent enough to describe his own retreat without ever quite admitting that retreat is what it was, and it is worth seeing what that cultural bunker actually looked like from the inside, because it is stranger and sadder than any ruin. While the countryside around them was being parcelled out and settled by Visigoths and Burgundians, while the imperial administration was quietly dissolving, the Gallo-Roman aristocrats wrote one another exquisite letters in perfect classical Latin. They traded poems. They praised each other's prose style and debated the proper construction of a line of verse. They hosted dinner parties where the talk was of literature and rhetoric, and the management of a well-run estate. They kept up the entire apparatus of being cultured Romans, the libraries, the correspondence, the literary games, with enormous and loving care, even as the political order that the whole performance had once rested on ceased to exist around them. Sidonius writes about ball games and bathhouses, and the pleasures of a friend's beautifully appointed villa with the same energy his grandfather might have spent governing a province. It reads, in places like the string quartet playing on the deck of a sinking ship. Except that these players seem to have half believed that if they performed the music well enough, the music itself might be the thing that survived. And the strangest part is that they were not entirely wrong. The Roman state died. Roman literary culture carried in precisely these letters and copied out in precisely the monasteries these aristocrats were retreating into, outlasted the state by 1,000 years. They could not save the empire, so they saved the style of it, the language and the learning and the manners, because the style turned out to be the part that was portable, and the empire itself was not. Even in culture, the rule held. What could be detached and carried, survived. What was rooted in the actual functioning of the state did not, and the empire repaid his loyalty in the most fitting way imaginable, which is to say, it sold him out. Sidonius and the people of Clermont held their city against the Visigoths through siege after siege, for years, on the strength of local will and local resources, and a bishop who refused to give up. And then the imperial government, what was left of it, sat down to negotiate a peace with the Visigothic king Euric, and in that negotiation it simply gave Clermont away, traded it, handed the city Sidonius had bled to defend to the very enemy he had defended it against. In exchange for territory the empire cared about more. The wall held. The center sold the wall. Sidonius was, for his trouble, taken into Visigothic custody, held for a period as a kind of prisoner of the new order, before eventually being allowed to return to his bishopric in a Gaul that was no longer in any meaningful sense Roman. The man who had given everything to the system was discarded by it, the instant his city became a useful bargaining chip. If you ever wanted proof that the center had stopped protecting even its most devoted servants, that loyalty to Rome had become a sucker's bet by the 470s, it is the spectacle of the Roman state trading away the one Roman aristocrat still willing to fight for it. I keep wanting to call all of this defense, the walls, the private soldiers, the fortified villas, the hard money. It looks like defense. It feels like defense. And I think this is the place to say the thing I have been circling, even though we are not quite ready to prove it yet, because it is going to govern everything from here to the end. Watch what defense actually does to the thing it claims to defend. A wall around your estate does not defend the empire. It defends you from the empire's failure, which means it is an admission that the empire is going to fail and a withdrawal of your resources from the common defense into a private one. Every private wall is a vote of no confidence rendered in stone, and every vote of no confidence makes the thing everyone is losing confidence in a little weaker. The defenses the elite built were real. They worked. They protected the people who built them. That is exactly the problem. They were private solutions to a public collapse. And a private solution to a public collapse is just a collapse, accelerating, wearing the mask of prudence. Hold that. We are going to need it. But walls and a fortified villa are still, you could argue, just defense. A frightened rich man building a wall is not the same as a rich man dismantling the state. To close that gap, you need to find the elite not just protecting themselves, but actively withdrawing the two things the state could not survive without: soldiers and money. And the late empire gives you both, in writing. Start with the soldiers, because this one is stark. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries, The Roman emperor no longer had a monopoly on organized violence inside his own empire. The great landowners and generals had started keeping private armies. They were called bucellarii, which translates with grim Roman humor as something like biscuit eaters, men who ate their patrons' bread, professional armed retainers bound by personal oath to the man who paid them rather than to the Roman state. The term comes into common use under the Emperor Honorius, in exactly the period we have been talking about. These were not ragtag bodyguards. They were often well-equipped, well-trained cavalry, frequently better motivated than the regular troops because their loyalty was personal and their paymaster was right there. The poet Claudian describes such private forces attached to the great power brokers of the age. A century later, the general Belisarius would field thousands of his own bucellarii, a private army larger than many a small kingdom's. Picture how that actually worked on the ground, because the mechanics are the whole point. A great landowner, sitting on the rents from estates in 5 provinces, would take a portion of that gold and use it to recruit and equip fighting men, often Goths or Huns or other barbarians who were the finest heavy cavalry available anywhere, and bind them to himself by a personal oath. They lived on his land and ate at his expense. They swore their loyalty not to Rome, not to the emperor, not to any abstraction of the state, but to the man who fed them, the man whose bread they ate, and who stood right in front of them. And in return he had, parked on his own property, a unit of professional soldiers answerable to nobody but him. Now multiply that across every magnate in the Western Empire wealthy enough to afford it, and you can watch the army of Rome quietly dissolving into 1,000 private retinues, each one loyal to its paymaster rather than to any flag. The gold that might have funded a legion on the Rhine was instead funding a bodyguard on a country estate. The same wealth the state desperately needed to defend everyone was being spent perfectly legally and perfectly rationally to defend one family and its land. Private security for those who could afford it, and for everyone who could not, an emptier and emptier frontier. Understand what this means structurally. The most basic definition of a state, the thing that makes it a state at all, is that it holds the monopoly on legitimate force within its territory. When the wealthy start fielding their own private armies, that monopoly is gone. The military is no longer a single national institution funded by everyone for the protection of everyone. It is fragmenting into a patchwork of private retinues loyal to whoever can pay them. The elite were not just hiding behind walls. They were privatizing the army itself, building personal protection outside the public system, in precisely the way a modern billionaire builds private security rather than relying on the police. And every soldier who became some magnate's personal bucellarius was a soldier no longer defending the frontier of the empire as a whole. The defense of everyone was quietly becoming the defense of a few, paid for privately, available only to those who could afford it. And the public army, the one the state still nominally ran, was rotting in a parallel direction, toward the same destination of private loyalty. As the tax base shrank and citizens grew less willing to serve and pay, the empire increasingly stopped raising armies from its own people and started renting them. It hired whole barbarian nations as federates, foederati, paying them in gold and in grants of land inside the empire to fight on Rome's behalf, which meant the defense of Rome was being subcontracted to the very peoples Rome was defending against. And the men who commanded these forces, the great generals of the last century, were figures like Stilicho, who was half Vandal, and Aetius, who had spent years as a hostage among the Huns and could summon them as allies, and later Ricimer, a Germanic warlord who made and unmade emperors at will, without ever sitting on the throne himself. The real power in the late Western Empire was not the emperor. It was whichever general controlled the army, and the army increasingly followed the general rather than the state, because the general was the one who paid it and led it and shared its loyalties. The Roman army had become a collection of personal and ethnic retinues wearing the costume of a national institution, and the emperors were increasingly puppets of whichever strongman held the troops. Put the public and the private side by side, and you see the same disease in two forms. The magnates built private armies of bucularii, loyal to themselves. The state built a public army that was barbarian in composition and loyal to its warlord generals rather than to Rome. From both directions, organized force was detaching from the idea of the empire and reattaching to particular men. The monopoly on violence did not vanish in a single dramatic moment. It dissolved, dispersing into 100 private hands, until there was no longer any such thing as the Roman army. Only armies, each belonging to someone, none belonging to Rome. And then there is the money, and this is the heart of it, the place where you can prove, in the empire's own legal language, that the elite were pulling the fiscal foundation out from under the state. To see it, you have to understand a class of people you have probably never heard of, the curiales, and the slow-motion catastrophe that the historians call the flight of the curiales. The curiales, also called decurions, were the local governing class of every town in the empire. The town councillors, the middle and upper tier of provincial society, the men of property who ran municipal life. And they had one duty above all others that made their position, in the late empire, into a trap. They were personally and collectively responsible for their town's taxes. Their job was to assess and collect the imperial tax from their district, and if the district came up short, the curiales had to make up the difference out of their own pockets. As the empire's military costs spiraled, and the tax demands from the center grew heavier and heavier, this stopped being an honor and became a financial sentence. To be a curial in the late empire was to be personally liable for an ever-growing tax burden you could not possibly meet, with the threat of ruin if your town fell short. So, the curiales did the rational thing. They ran. They fled their own class. They sought any escape that carried legal exemption from curial duties, and there were a few. You could get into the Senate, which was exempt. You could enter the imperial bureaucracy, which was exempt. And above all, you could enter the church, the clergy, which was exempt. So the men of property abandoned their posts as the funders and administrators of local Roman life and poured into the Senate, the civil service, and the priesthood, anywhere the tax liability could not follow them. We have a hard number for how bad this got from the orator Libanius, who lived through it in the great eastern city of Antioch. The city council of Antioch, he tells us, fell from 600 members to 60. From 600 to 60. A 90% collapse in the number of men willing to shoulder the duty of running and funding their own city. Picture a town where 90% of the people responsible for keeping the lights on have quietly resigned and disappeared into whatever loophole they could find, leaving the impossible burden on the shrinking handful too poor or too slow to escape. That is what the spine of the Roman tax system looked like in its final century. It was hemorrhaging its own administrators. And we know precisely how the imperial government responded, because the response is preserved in the law codes, and the law codes are the most damning evidence of all. The emperors fought the flight of the curiales the only way they knew how. They made laws. They passed law after law after law, trying to chain the curiales to their posts, forbidding them to flee, dragging them back, closing the loopholes one by one. They ruled that a decurion could not enter the church without first surrendering his property to the council, so the tax liability stayed behind. They ruled, under Theodosius II, that even claiming to be a heretic which would normally bar you from public position, would not be enough to release a decuran from what the law itself called his onerous financial burdens. You could not even escape by declaring yourself a religious outcast. The trap was sealing shut. By one scholarly count of the relevant late Roman legislation, there are 192 separate laws attempting to bind the curiales to their duties across roughly a century. 192. And I want you to think about what it means when a government passes the same law 192 times. It does not mean the law was working. You do not need to pass a law 192 times if it works the first time. You pass a law 192 times when it is failing 192 times, when the people it targets are evading it faster than you can write it, when every new version is a confession that the last version did not hold. When a state writes the same desperate law that many times, it is not governing, it is begging. And nobody was listening. Underneath the flight of the curiales ran an even deeper rot, with a name, patrocinium, patronage, the ordinary free farmers of the empire, crushed between the tax collectors and the insecurity of the countryside, started doing something that, in the long run, dissolved the Roman state from below. They went to the great local magnate, the man with the walls and the private army, and they handed over the title to their land in exchange for his protection, both from the barbarians and, tellingly, from the empire's own tax collectors. The magnate absorbed the land into his vast estate and used his power to shield it from imperial assessment. The farmer became, in effect, the magnate's man, working land he no longer legally owned, protected by private power, invisible to the state. Every transaction like that shrank the empire's tax base and grew the private power of the magnates. The land and the people on it were not destroyed. They were simply moved, parcel by parcel, off the books of the empire and onto the private ledgers of the elite. The state passed laws against this too, fining the protectors 25 to 40 pounds of gold for every person they sheltered. And the records note, with what I imagine was bitter resignation, that the laws had little effect. And the cruelest part of the mechanism is that it fed on itself, the way these things always do, accelerating as it went. Every curial who escaped into the Senate or the church or the bureaucracy did not make the tax burden disappear. He just moved his share of it onto the shoulders of the curiales who remained. So the men still trapped in the council found their personal liability rising every time one of their colleagues got out, which gave each of them an even more desperate reason to get out themselves, which raised the burden on the dwindling remnant again. It was a death spiral, with a perfectly clear internal logic. The fewer people left holding the system, the heavier the system became for each of them, the faster they fled. 600 members down to 60 was not a slow leak. It was a structure collapsing under its own incentives, each departure making the next one more rational, until almost nobody sane would stay. And notice, who got the exits? The escape routes from curial duty were the Senate, the imperial civil service, and the clergy, which is to say the exits were reserved for the powerful, the connected, and those wealthy enough to buy or marry or pray their way into an exempt class. Power itself had become a tax shield. The more important you were, the less you paid into the system that your importance depended on. The exemptions flowed to exactly the people most able to afford the taxes and away from exactly the people least able to bear them, which is the signature of every system in its terminal phase. A state of affairs where contribution to the common good runs in inverse proportion to the capacity to contribute. The strong stopped paying. The burden rolled downhill and pooled at the bottom, on the small farmers and the shrinking middle, until the bottom did the only thing left to do, which was to stop being Roman at all, to hand their land to a magnate or flee to the barbarians, and either way to vanish off the tax rolls entirely. The base did not erode evenly. It eroded from the top down, as the powerful exempted themselves first, and the burden concentrated on the powerless until the powerless dissolved. The empire was being hollowed out from the inside, not by its enemies, but by the defensive arrangements of its own most powerful people, each of whom was behaving with perfect individual rationality and contributing to a collective catastrophe. And now we arrive at the place I promised you we were heading, the bottom of the logic, the point where the hedge stops being a symptom of the collapse and reveals itself as a cause of it. Here it is, as plainly as I can put it. The wealthy elite were pulling out of the system, the gold going into the ground, the estates being liquidated and carried to Africa, the land vanishing into protected private hands, the curiales fleeing the tax rolls. All of it was the same wealth that funded the army that defended the frontier whose collapse was the thing the elite were hedging against in the first place. Do you see the loop? Do you see how it closes on itself and bites its own tail? The elite saw the danger. To protect themselves from the danger, they withdrew their wealth from the system. But their wealth was the system's defense. So withdrawing it made the danger worse, which gave them more reason to withdraw more, which made the danger worse still. The hedge was not a response to the collapse. The hedge was the engine of the collapse. Every rational individual decision to get liquid, to get behind walls, to get out of the tax base, to buy private soldiers instead of funding public ones, subtracted from the common defense and accelerated the very thing everyone was running from. They were not fleeing a fire. They were fleeing a fire while carrying away the water. This is the second time in this story I have to point at the official version and tell you it has been pointing you at the wrong culprit, and this one is the big one. We blame the barbarians. We have always blamed the barbarians. Rome fell to the Goths, the Vandals, the Huns, the hordes at the gate. But the barbarians were never strong enough to take Rome on their own. They had tried for centuries and failed. What changed was not that the barbarians got stronger. What changed was that Rome stopped funding the wall, because the people who could have funded it had decided, individually and rationally and quietly, to spend their gold on their own survival instead. The barbarians did not break down the door. The door was unlocked from the inside, key by key, fortune by fortune, by the people who had already moved their valuables to another house. We blame the barbarians because the barbarians are foreigners, and it is so much easier to believe you were killed by a stranger than to admit you were abandoned by your own. And the state knew. That is the part that turns this from a tragedy into something closer to a documented crime, because the Roman state itself wrote down, in its own laws, the moment it admitted it could no longer afford to defend itself. As the Vandals took North Africa, and the city of Carthage fell on the 19th of October in the year 439, the Western Empire lost its single richest tax and grain-producing province in one stroke. By the year 444, the government was officially broke. And on the 14th of July, 444, the Emperor Valentinian III issued a law that did something the Roman state had almost never done. It confessed. The law abolished an old exemption and created new taxes, and it stated the reason in plain language, that there was not enough revenue to maintain the army, that the treasury could not meet the cost of the soldiers needed to defend the empire. The state put it in writing. We cannot pay for our own defense. That is the bottom of the spiral made official. Decades of elite hedging, the gold in the ground from the late 300s, the liquidations, the flight of the curiales, the patrocinium swallowing the land, had shrunk the tax base until the state confessed in a public law that it could no longer afford an army. After that, The rest is just timing. An empire that cannot pay its soldiers does not have soldiers. An empire without soldiers does not have a frontier. And an empire without a frontier is just a collection of walled estates, waiting for someone to come and take them one at a time. The year 476, when a Germanic general named Odoacer deposed a teenage emperor named Romulus Augustulus and did not bother to appoint a replacement, was not the fall of Rome. It was the paperwork. The fall had happened years earlier, in 1,000 private accounting decisions and one public law admitting the money was gone. 476 was just the day someone finally noticed the building was empty and turned off the lights. Let me lay the whole timeline out in one line so you can feel how long the warning was visible, because the length of it is the thing that should haunt you. In the 380s of the 4th century, the historian Ammianus Marcellinus is already describing a Roman senatorial class that has checked out, idle and self-indulgent, the men who should be steering the ship gone below decks. In the late 4th century, the gold starts going into the ground in a wave that never recedes. In the 390s and the 400s, the private armies become common. Around 404 to 408, Melania liquidates 8 provinces and starts moving. In 407 to 408, the Hoxne man buries his chest as Britain is abandoned. In 408, one senator's income equals the ransom of Rome. In 410, Rome is sacked and Melania is already gone. In 439, Carthage falls. In 444, the state admits in writing that it cannot afford to defend itself. In 476, the lights go off. From the first measurable hedging to the official end is roughly 80 to 100 years, 3 to 4 human generations. A person could have been born when the gold first started going into the ground in alarming quantities, lived a full long life watching the warning signs accumulate, and died of old age before the formal end arrived. The collapse was not a bolt from the sky. It was a slow, legible 80-year process that the people with the best information read correctly and responded to by saving themselves, and that the official story has compressed into a single dramatic date so that you would never have to look at the 80 years of choices that led up to. And there is something in that 80-year span that I think is the hardest part of the whole thing to sit with, and it is not the speed of the ending. It is the slowness. Because the slowness is exactly what made it survivable to ignore. If Rome had fallen in a single afternoon, everyone would have seen it for what it was. Catastrophes that arrive in an afternoon get understood as catastrophes. But a collapse that takes 3 generations does not feel like a collapse to the people living through any one year of it. It feels like a bad decade followed by a slightly worse one. It feels like things being a little harder than they used to be. The taxes a little higher. The roads a little less safe. The coins a little less trustworthy. The news from the frontier a little worse. Every year, by an increment small enough to absorb and explain away. Each individual year was livable. You could raise your children and run your farm and attend the games and tell yourself that this was simply how things were now, and that they would surely turn around eventually, the way they always had before, because within living memory they actually had, in the 3rd century, when the empire nearly died and then clawed its way back. The people who buried the gold were the ones who managed to see the trend through all that noise, to recognize that this time the curve was not going to bend back. And that recognition was rare, precisely because every single year handed everyone a fresh and reasonable excuse to believe the trouble was temporary. Collapse does not announce itself. It does not arrive. It accretes, one tolerable disappointment at a time, until one day the thing everyone is still describing in the present tense turns out to have been gone for years, and the only people who noticed in time were the ones already packing. And we can hear the contemporaries who did look. There were people at the time who saw exactly what was happening, and said so in language that survives. And their voices are the closest thing this story has to witnesses on the stand. The first is the man I mentioned, Ammianus Marcellinus, a professional soldier turned historian writing in the 380s, a full generation before the sack of Rome. He turned his eye on the senatorial aristocracy of the city, the class with all the wealth, and what he saw was a kind of magnificent uselessness. He wrote that the few great houses, once famous for serious intellectual life, had given themselves over to idleness and indulgence, and that the libraries, he said, were shut up tight like tombs. The libraries are shut up like tombs. The class that should have been thinking hardest about the survival of their civilization had stopped thinking at all. They had checked out a generation before the disaster, and a soldier with a pen noticed and wrote it down, and nobody who mattered cared. The second witness is Angria, and he is the one I keep returning to, a priest from southern Gaul named Salvian, writing in the 440s, right around the time the state was admitting it could not pay its army. Salvian wrote a book whose title translates as On the Government of God, and it is essentially a prosecution of the Roman elite for the destruction of their own society. He does not blame the barbarians. He blames the Romans, specifically the wealthy landed class, for so crushing the poor with taxes and exploitation that the poor would rather live under the barbarians than under Rome. And he records something that should stop you cold, because it is the bottom of the system falling out in real time. He writes that Romans were fleeing to the barbarians, actually fleeing, abandoning Roman territory to go live among the Goths and other peoples, because, in his words, they would rather live as free men under an outward appearance of captivity than as captives under an outward appearance of freedom. The Roman name, he says, once not only valued, but bought at great price, was now being thrown away and fled from. And it went further than individuals slipping across the border one family at a time. In Gaul and in Spain across the 4th and 5th centuries, whole regions of the rural poor rose up and seceded from the empire from the inside, in revolts the Romans called the Bagadae. These were not simple bandits, though the official sources like to call them that. They were peasants and ruined smallholders and runaway tenants who, crushed between the tax collectors and the magnates, withdrew from Roman authority entirely and set up their own self-governing zones, their own rough courts and leaders, in the gaps where imperial control had failed. They had concluded, exactly as the rich had concluded, that the Roman system was no longer worth belonging to, and they acted on it, except their version of getting out was not a chest of gold or a villa in Africa. It was armed secession, a withdrawal of their bodies and their land and their labor from a state that offered them nothing but extraction. And Salvian, the priest, takes their side. He says, in so many words, that the Bagaudae were made, not born, that they were driven into revolt by the rapacity and injustice of Roman officials and the powerful, that they fled to a freedom of their own making, because Roman justice had become a thing that existed only to rob them. A churchman of the empire looked at the peasants who had renounced the empire and said, plainly, that the empire had earned it. So the secession ran the entire height of the society. The magnates seceded upward into private wealth and private armies and gold that owed loyalty to no flag. The peasants seceded downward and outward into the Bagaudae and into the arms of the barbarians, and in between, the dwindling administrative class seceded sideways into every exempt institution it could reach. From top to bottom, everyone who could find an exit was taking it, and the only thing still called Rome was the shrinking space occupied by the people who had not yet found their door. Hold those two flights next to each other, because together they are the whole picture. At the top, the rich are fleeing the system upward and outward, converting to gold, moving to safer provinces, buying private protection, escaping the tax base. At the bottom, the poor are fleeing the system downward and outward, abandoning Roman citizenship itself to go live among the very barbarians the system claimed to be protecting them from. The middle, the curiales, are fleeing sideways into any exempt institution they can find. Everyone who can read the situation is leaving by whatever exit is available to them. The only people left holding the system are the ones with no way out. And Salvian's verdict on the whole spectacle, written as the army went unpaid, was that it was not the barbarians who conquered Rome. It was, he said, our own vices that defeated us. The collapse was an inside job, and a man living through it said so in plain words. And his book was read as a sermon about sin, rather than as the autopsy of a state that it actually was. That is the abdication of authority at its most complete. Not just that the leaders failed to act. They saw, they understood, they wrote it down, and the witnesses who named it were filed under theology and moralizing and ignored. The information was never missing. The information was abundant. Ammianus saw it in the 380s. Melania the Elder said it at the dinner table around 400. The hordes recorded it in the ground from the late 300s. Salvian prosecuted it in the 440s. The state confessed it in law in 444. The warning was screaming from every direction for a century, and the response of the people who could have acted on it was to make sure they personally would not be there when the bill came due. So I told you the central question was how early you can see the end coming. And we have an answer now, and the answer is genuinely disturbing. You can see it about 80 years early. You can date it. You can hold the gold in your hand and read the year off the coins. But that answer just makes the real question worse, the way the best answers always do. Because if it was this visible for this long, then the failure to stop it was not a failure of perception. They saw it fine. It was a failure of will, or rather it was not a failure at all. It was a choice, the choice of the people with the most power and the best information to use both for private escape rather than public repair. And that raises the worst question of the whole story, the one I have been circling. Is that just what elites do? When a system starts to fail, do the people at the top always read it early and hedge out, dooming everyone below them? Is the elite hedge a law of history, as reliable as the hordes going into the ground? To answer that, I had to find a case where the elite did the opposite. A collapse where the people at the top did not hedge, did not get liquid, did not flee. And there is one on the other side of the world, separated from Rome by an ocean and 1,000 years, and it is the perfect mirror. Because the Maya elite, facing the end of their own world, did the one thing the Roman elite did not. They went down with the ship. And understanding why turns out to be the key that unlocks everything. The classic Maya civilization of the southern lowlands, in what is now Guatemala and southern Mexico and Belize, was one of the most sophisticated cultures the Americas ever produced. A constellation of city-states with monumental architecture, a written language, and astronomy precise enough to predict eclipses centuries in advance. And between roughly the years 750 and 900, over the span of a century and a half, it came apart. The great cities were abandoned, the populations dispersed or died. The institution at the center of it all, divine kingship, simply ceased to exist. And like the Roman hordes, the Maya collapse left a clock, except the Maya clock is even more precise. Because the Maya were obsessed with dates and carved them into stone. The Maya tracked time using what we call the long count, an elaborate calendar that counted the days elapsed since a mythological starting point, and they inscribed these dates onto stone monuments called stelae, tall carved slabs that the divine kings erected to commemorate their reigns, their victories, their rituals. Every stela is a dated statement of royal power. I, the divine king, on this exact day performed this sacred act. And because every stela carries a precise long count date, the stela are a city-wide heartbeat. As long as a city is carving dated monuments, its institution of kingship is alive and functioning. When the monuments stop, the heartbeat has stopped. And we can watch them stop, city by city, like lights going out across a dark countryside. There is a study by Ebert and colleagues that mapped 89 of these terminal long count dates, the last gasp of each city's monument record, and the picture is not a single sudden collapse, but a staggered cascade. And I want to correct a misconception here, because the popular image of the Maya collapse is wrong in a way that matters. The Maya did not mysteriously vanish. That is the version in the documentaries, the abandoned cities swallowed by jungle, a whole people gone without a trace. It is nonsense. The Maya people did not vanish. There are millions of Maya alive today, speaking Mayan languages, descendants of the people who lived through this. What collapsed was not a race. It was a specific political institution, divine kingship, and the elite culture built on top of it. The kings vanished. The people endured. Keep that distinction, because it is exactly the distinction that reveals what the elite were doing. The last dated monuments fall silent across the lowlands over a span the studies put at somewhere between 24 and 127 years, depending on the region. The great city of Calakmul carves its last dated monument around the year 810. Tikal, one of the largest cities of them all, falls silent with a monument dated to about 869. And the very last long count dates anywhere, the final ticks of the entire civilization's clock, come from the site of Tanina, with a monument dated to the year 909, and from a place called Itzimte, with a stela dated to about 910. After that, silence, no more dated monuments. The heartbeat flatlines across the whole lowland world within the span of a couple of human lifetimes. So far, this sounds like Rome, a datable clock, a measurable decline over decades, an elite institution ceasing to function. But here is where the mirror inverts, and where the contrast becomes the most illuminating thing in this entire story. Watch what the Maya elite did as their world began to fail, because it is the exact opposite of what the Roman elite did. The Roman elite, facing collapse, pulled inward and downward. They converted, they liquidated, they got liquid, they retreated behind private walls, they withdrew from public obligation, they made themselves smaller and more portable and more survivable as individuals. They hedged. The Maya elite, facing collapse, did the reverse. They escalated. As drought and soil exhaustion and overpopulation bore down on the lowlands, the divine kings did not quietly convert their wealth and slip away to safer cities. They could not, and to understand why is to understand the whole thing. They intensified the very behaviors that defined them as elite. They built more monuments, not fewer, competing for prestige right up to the end. They went to war with each other more, not less. The archaeologist Arthur Demarest, working in the Petik-Spatoon region, documented warfare in the final period escalating into something endemic and unrecoverable, a landscape of siege and fortification, villages themselves walled against attack, a society tearing itself apart in status competition and conflict at the exact moment cooperation might have saved it. Demarest's phrase for what drove it is short-term thinking driven by political and economic competition, war and status rivalry, leading the leadership down a path toward ecological self-destruction. There is one monument that holds the whole Maya ending inside a single frozen image, and it sits in the city of Copan, in what is now western Honduras, close to the border with Guatemala. Copan had been ruled by a dynasty of divine kings for 4 centuries, 16 of them in an unbroken line, each commemorated in some of the finest stone carving the Americas ever produced. The 16th king had set up a famous round altar, which we call Altar Q, showing all 16 rulers seated in succession around its sides, a portrait of a dynasty that plainly believed it would go on forever. And then a 17th man, named Ukit Tuk, came to power in the year 822, and he commissioned his own altar in exactly the same style, meaning to carve himself into that eternal line. The altar was never finished. One face of it was completed, showing the new king's enthronement. A second face was only begun, the figures sketched in, but never cut. And the remaining faces were left entirely blank, bare stone, the chisel having stopped partway through the work and never resumed. The dynasty of Copan did not end with a battle, or a sack, or a single dramatic fall. It ended with a stonemason setting down his tools in the middle of a carving and never coming back, because the city around him was emptying out, and the labor and the resources and the very point of proclaiming a living God king had all quietly evaporated while the work was still in progress. The last king of Copan was trying to crown himself onto a monument that the collapse interrupted before it could be completed. And I cannot stop putting that image next to the chest in the Suffolk field, because the two of them are the same shape seen from opposite ends. The man at Hoxne buried his fortune fully intending to come back for it, and the world ended before he could. The mason at Copan began his king's monument fully intending to finish it, and the world ended before he could. One is an interrupted escape, the other is an interrupted performance. And the entire difference between them, the whole distance between the two collapses, is the difference between an elite whose wealth let them leave and an elite whose wealth left them no choice but to keep performing until the stone went silent in the middle of a word. And we are not guessing about the drought, which is the part that makes the Maya clock as hard as the Roman one. The climate that the kings were failing to survive is recorded in stone and mud with extraordinary precision. There is a stalagmite from a cave called Yok Balum in Belize that grew, layer by layer, fed by rainwater dripping through the rock, and the chemistry of its layers preserves a year-by-year record of how wet or dry each year was for more than 2,000 years. There are sediment cores pulled from the bottom of lakes like Chichancanabe in the Yucatan, where the mineral layers laid down in dry years differ measurably from the layers laid down in wet ones. And these records agree. They show that the final centuries of the classic Maya world, the 8th and 9th centuries, were punctuated by some of the most severe and prolonged droughts in the entire record, multi-decade dry spells landing precisely on the period when the cities were falling silent one after another. The kings were not imagining the crisis. The sky was closing over them measurably, and the proof is hanging from the roofs of caves. And the crisis reached even the bodies of the elite, which is the last proof that they had no exit. In the final years at Copan, the bones tell the story. The skeletal record of the nobility themselves shows the marks of disease and malnutrition, the same afflictions that were tearing through the common population in the streets below the palaces. Because when the food system failed and epidemics began to spread through the malnourished masses, they spread upward into the great houses too. There was no clean district to retreat to. A Roman senator, when the plague or the famine came, could carry his gold to a province where the granaries were still full and the sickness had not yet arrived. The Maya lord had nowhere to carry anything, and nothing he could have carried. The disease that took the poor took the nobility in the same city, in the same seasons, off the same failing land, because every one of them was standing on the same collapsing ground. Only one civilization in this entire story had managed to build itself an elite whose wealth let them go and stand somewhere else. And that single fact is the difference between a people who scattered and survived as individuals and a people who stayed in place and were buried where they stood. And what did the divine kings do as the rain failed and the reservoirs dropped? There is one site that answers this so vividly it has stayed with me, a Petixbatun capital called Dos Pilas. As the wars closed in and the end approached, the people of Dos Pilas did something that tells you everything about the difference between this collapse and the Roman one. They tore apart their own monuments. They dismantled the royal palace and the ceremonial buildings, the very structures that embodied the king's divine authority, and they used the stone to throw up crude defensive walls, hasty fortifications right across the center of their own sacred city, and they crowded behind them. The Roman aristocrat converted his palace into portable gold and carried it to safety. The Maya of Dos Pilas could not do that because their palace was not convertible into anything, so instead they cannibalized it for rubble to build a wall they then lost anyway. The same stone that had proclaimed the king a god became the last desperate barricade of a people with nowhere to run. There is no clearer image in all of this of what it means to have wealth that cannot be detached from the system. When the end came, the Romans turned their grandeur into an exit. The Maya could only turn theirs into a wall and then die behind it. Why could the Maya kings not hedge the way the Roman senators did? Because of what their wealth was. A Roman senator's wealth was, increasingly, gold, the most portable, fungible, escapable form of value ever devised, something you could carry across 8 provinces or bury in a Suffolk field. But a Maya divine king's wealth was not gold. His wealth was his divinity. His status was a religious performance, a claim to be a living intermediary between the people and the gods, and that claim was made and remade through exactly the things he could not take with him: the monuments, the rituals, the temples, the public spectacle of kingship rooted in one specific sacred place. A Maya king's power was non-portable by its very nature. He could not convert it to anything liquid because its entire value came from its being fixed, public, performed, and tied to his city. The moment he stopped performing it, he stopped being a king. He could not get liquid because there was nothing to get liquid into. His only move, as the pressure mounted, was to perform harder, build bigger, fight more, double down on the divine claim, because the alternative to being a divine king was not being a private rich man. It was being nothing. So the Maya elite went down with the system, because they were the system in a way the Roman elite never were. The Roman senator could survive the death of Rome because his wealth was separable from Rome. He could carry it to Jerusalem. The Maya king could not survive the death of his kingship because his wealth was his kingship. There was no Jerusalem to carry it to. And so when the end came, the Roman elite scattered like seeds on the wind, carrying their gold to 100 safer harbors, and the Maya elite stayed exactly where they were and were buried under the rubble of the temples they kept building until the very last dated stone. 2 clocks. The Hoxne chest, buried 408, marking the moment an elite got out. The last stela at Tanina, carved 909, marking the moment an elite that could not get out finally stopped. Both are measuring the same thing: the death of a civilization legible in the behavior of the people at the top. But they are measuring it from opposite ends, and the contrast tells you precisely what variable matters. It is not whether the elite see the collapse coming. Both elites saw it coming. The Maya kings were not fools. They were watching their reservoirs dry up, and their wars spiral, and their world contract, and they responded the only way their position allowed. The variable that matters is whether the elite's wealth can be detached from the system and carried to safety. When it can, they detach it, and the detaching is itself the thing that kills the system. When it cannot, they are chained to the system's fate, and they ride it down. And that, finally, is the deepest and most uncomfortable thing this whole investigation has been building toward. The implication I have been circling since the man in the field, and I want to state it as plainly and as carefully as I can, because it is the part that changes how you see your own time, and it is the part nobody wants to say out loud. The health of a civilization may be best measured not by how rich its elite are, but by how detachable that wealth is from the fate of everyone else. Sit with that, because it inverts everything you have been taught to look at. We measure the strength of a society by its wealth at the top, its great fortunes, its booming markets, its billionaires. But the Roman evidence and the Maya mirror together suggest that this is exactly the wrong instrument. A society is not safe because its elite are rich. A society is safe when its elite cannot get their wealth out, when the fortunes of the powerful are welded to the fortunes of the whole, when the person at the top would lose everything if the system failed and therefore has every incentive to keep it from failing. The Maya kings, for all the brutality of their world, were welded to their people's fate by the very nature of their power, and so they fought to the last stone to keep the system alive, even destructively, even uselessly, because they had no exit. The Roman senators had an exit, and the existence of that exit is precisely what doomed everyone who did not have one. The detachability of elite wealth is not a sign of a sophisticated economy. It is the dissolving agent. It is the thing that lets the people with the most power and the best information walk away from the burning house with their valuables, leaving everyone else inside. And here is where the warning becomes a measurement, which is where this began. Because if the elite hedge is the leading indicator, and if it leaves a physical, datable signature, the gold in the ground, the walls on the villas, the private armies, the laws written in panic, the wealth converting from the immovable to the portable, then it is not a thing you can only see in hindsight. It is a thing you can see in advance. The Hoxne man left us a timestamp. The hordes plotted on a graph make a wave you can watch rising. The signature exists before the collapse, by decades, which means in principle it is always there to be read, in any society, including one you happen to be living inside, if you knew to look at the behavior of the people at the top rather than at the speeches they give. What are the fortunes of the powerful converting into? Are they welding their wealth to the common fate, or are they making it portable, liquid, mobile, escapable? Are they building the public wall, or are they building private ones? Are they staying, or are they quietly, rationally, decades early, getting their money out? I am not going to stand here and point at the present and name names, because the moment you do that, the analysis curdles into a lecture and you stop thinking and start arguing. The Roman caveats apply to every age, including ours. Rich people have always built nice houses and moved their money around, and most of the time it means nothing. And a hoard is not a census, and a single buried chest is just one frightened man. The honest position is the careful one. The elite hedge is a symptom and an accelerant, not a simple cause, and history does not repeat on a schedule you can set your watch by. But I will say the thing the careful position still leaves standing, because it is true, and it is the reason this story has had its grip on me. The instruments still work. The gold still goes into the ground, in whatever form gold takes now. The walls still go up. The wealth still tells you, if you watch it instead of listening to the words around it, what the people who hold it actually believe is coming. The signature of elite defection is not a relic of a dead empire. It is a permanent feature of how complex societies die, and it is, in every case we can measure, legible in advance to anyone willing to read the ground instead of the chronicle. The Romans had every instrument they needed to read it. Ammianus read it and called the libraries tombs. Salvian read it and called it suicide. The hordes read it and went into the ground by the thousand. Melania the elder read it and warned the senators at dinner. The state read it and confessed in law. And it changed nothing, because the people who could have changed it were the same people whose private, rational, individually sensible response to reading it was to make sure they personally got out. The reading of the warning and the cause of the catastrophe were the same act, performed by the same hands. And then we told the story so that you would never see this. That is the part that moves me from sadness to something closer to anger, because the burial of this reading was not an accident of missing evidence. The evidence was always there. It was a choice about which story to tell, made over and over by the people who shaped how we remember Rome. Edward Gibbon, whose great history fixed the fall of Rome in the modern imagination, blamed two things above all: the rise of Christianity, which he said drained the martial spirit of the empire, and a vague moral decadence, a softening of the old Roman virtue. Both of those put the cause inside the character of the people, a failure of spirit, a loss of nerve, which is a comfortable thing to believe because it makes collapse a moral fable rather than a structural one. The other dominant story, the one in the school textbooks, is the barbarian invasion, the map with the big red arrows pouring across the frontiers, which makes collapse something done to Rome from outside by violent strangers. Decadence and invasion, a morality tale and a war story. Those are the two versions you inherited, and notice what they have in common. Neither one asks you to look at where the money went. Neither one puts the richest and most powerful people in the society at the center of the autopsy. Neither one says the people at the top read the situation correctly and saved themselves at everyone else's expense, because that version implicates a class that tends to survive collapses and write the histories afterward. The fiscal reading, the one we have been building, the one where the elite hedge hollows out the tax base until the state cannot defend itself, came much later and lives mostly in the specialist literature, in the work of economic historians and archaeologists, counting coins and mapping hoards, where the general public never goes. It is not hidden in a vault, it is worse than hidden. It is published, peer-reviewed, sitting in journals and excavation reports, and simply not told, because it does not make a clean morality tale, and it does not have a satisfying foreign villain, and it points the finger in a direction that polite history prefers not to. The story of how Rome actually died is not a secret. It is something more frustrating than a secret. It is a truth that has been available the whole time, and that nobody with a megaphone wanted to repeat. And the result is that you grew up believing in barbarians and decadence, while the coins in the museum drawers told a colder and more specific story to anyone who bothered to read them. We did not even keep the lesson. That is the final injustice, the one that brings me back to where we started. For centuries after, those buried chests came out of the ground all across what had been the empire, hundreds of them, thousands, and we did with the evidence exactly what the Romans did with the warning. We mislabeled it. We dated the Great British Hordes to before the rupture instead of during it, filing the gold of the elite's flight under routine economic disruption, until a coin specialist counting wear on bronze had to drag the field, kicking, to the obvious conclusion that the panic belonged to the collapse, and not before. The warning was buried twice, once by the man who put it in the ground in 408, hoping to come back, and once by us when we dug it up and put it in a drawer under the wrong year. The dead man in the Suffolk field told us exactly when the smart money stopped believing in Rome, in gold, in a sealed oak chest, in a message that crossed 16 centuries of silence to reach us. And for most of those 16 centuries, we got the year wrong on purpose, because the right year was too specific, and the specificity implied something we did not want to think about. He buried 569 gold coins and the names of his family scratched on silver spoons. He lined the chest with cherry wood and yew. He marked the spot, the archaeologists think, with a post, so he could find it again. He intended to come back. He never came back. And the most disturbing thing about him, the thing I have not been able to put down since I started reading about all of this, is not that he was a coward, or a villain, or a fool. He was none of those things. He was right. He read his civilization correctly, earlier and more clearly than almost anyone, and he acted on what he read with perfect rationality. And the proof that he was right is that the system he buried his gold to escape did in fact collapse, exactly as he expected, on roughly the schedule he must have feared. You are not the senator burying the gold. Almost none of us are. You are the one who comes after 16 centuries later and finds the empty intention in the ground, the fortune that was meant to be retrieved by a man who knew the world was ending and assumed he would outlast it. And you read the year off the coins, and you realize that someone knew. Someone always knows. Someone read it early and got out and never told you, because telling you was never the point. The point was the chest. The point was getting the gold in the ground before the door closed. The door is always slightly ajar before anyone admits the house is on fire. That is not a metaphor. That is what the data says. The bunker is dug, the wealth is moved, the wall is raised, decades before the official date of death, by the people best equipped to see the death coming. And the rest of us learn the year afterward, off the coins, in a museum, standing in front of a chest that a frightened, rational, correct man lowered into the earth one autumn, while telling everyone around him, no doubt, that everything was going to be fine. It was not going to be fine. He knew it was not going to be fine. And he had his gold in the ground before the rest of them ever found out.